that as well. But prior to going to work at EPA, Dave ran the Environmental Protection Unit at the state of Wisconsin. He had also worked at the state of Wyoming in their Attorney General office, and has been a successful private practitioner, also an expert on the Endangered Species Act, and has advised many clients on things like wind sighting, and he's just got a remarkable legal career. And then Anna is equally talented. They're both graduates of the University of Vermont. I'll tell you who graduated first. Not first in his class, I mean first in time. But Anna was the principal deputy administrator, assistant administrator in the Office of Water as well. She likewise worked and ran the Department of the Environmental Protection Unit at the Wisconsin Department of Justice after Dave left, and then later joined David Babin. But prior to that, she's a friend of agriculture. She worked for the trade association, advising them and helping them with their government affairs in Wisconsin, the Dairy Association. If you haven't heard, dairy's big in Wisconsin. And they're now both partners at Troutman Pepper, who is, and William Droves is here, and Troutman's been a long time associate member and friend of SSEP. So a little bit of context. So Dave and Anna literally wrote the Waters of the United States rule under the Trump administration, and the 401 rule, along with lead and copper, PFAS response, and numerous rulemakings that are too long to list, DLG, things that you all have heard. But we're going to talk about a couple of things today. We're going to talk about Waters of the United States. Wouldn't be a good water panel without a discussion with water of the United States. We're going to talk a little bit about 401 and what that means for states. This new phenomenon of Maui versus Hawaii wildlife that should scare states, and the idea that groundwater may be regulated under the Clean Water Act. But before we start that, why don't we, just a couple quick questions. Dave, what are the things that you're seeing that are different, that may be something they haven't heard of, like Waters of the United States?
Well, hey, thanks, Ken. Thanks for the introduction. And if you guys have noticed, Ken has been up on the stage a lot, right? Your service to this organization, to this conference, your service to the state, and your service at EPA were remarkable. Just because you care. And if you guys were there at dinner last night, it was clear that Ken cares. And so I just want to start with all of us giving Ken some amazing appreciation. So. Thanks for the drinks last night. The thing what does the water sector, what does natural resource extractive industry, what does industry need to be thinking about? We'll talk about WOTUS. We're talking about Maui. We'll talk about 401. The things that the sexy policy issues that we all read about that drive content in newspapers. But the thing that actually keeps me up at night thinking about long term, this industry, actually any industry in this country, is water security. Water is integrated into energy. It has been, and it always will be. We had a great luncheon conversation with the hydrogen producing truck company yesterday at lunch. And I noticed that their production facility for hydrogen, which takes water, is located in Arizona. That is a water-stressed state. What's happening right now in the Colorado River, in the Trump administration, we had that early on, the first couple of years. We almost had a call on the river. We are now in a call on the river status. And so as you're thinking about, where you run your businesses, how you're developing, whether or not it's renewable uses water, solar uses water, hydrogen uses water. Obviously, the focus has always been on nuclear uses water, coal generating power plants, water. Water is there, but if we don't think about it, if we don't start thinking about where our water is going to come from, both from a water quality standpoint and a water availability standpoint, we're not thinking about water security, and that really is a business risk going forward for you all. And so, one of the things if you ask what I'm most proud of at EPA, we did a national water use action plan. We formed the water sub-cabinet that got the 7 major federal agencies together, focused on water, big federal budget, trying to do integrated water planning for the United States, and water sector workforce. Those 3 initiatives are 3 initiatives that the Biden administration hasn't overturned. They've pretty much overturned everything else I probably worked on. Those 3 things, they can't trumpet them because we're not supposed to get along. But those 3 things, that executive order is still in play for the water sub-cabinet, the National Water Use Action Plan, where produce water, and the oil and gas play is very important. Those things are a foundation for what water looks like 10, 15, 20 years from now. And my number 1 message to folks when I talk about is you're not thinking water without your ESG disclosures. That's coming. It's not just climate, it'll be water. But if you're not thinking about water security, you're missing a major business risk. So the thing that keeps me up at night is water security.
And I think that also goes into maybe what some of the things that you're thinking about as well, Anna.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with everything that they said. The other thing that keeps me up at night is not knowing what all the agencies are doing behind closed doors. And so I came across a couple of pretty significant rulemakings that EPA is pursuing right now that they're not getting the attention, that the WOTUS or the 401 or the many other, methane rules are getting in the press, but they're really important. So I'm going to share them. I'm going to go a little bit into the weeds on them right here so that folks can get a sense of what they are. But there are 2 rulemakings that EPA is pursuing right now that could really change the way that the Water Act is administered in certain parts of the country where there are tribal interests. And so just for context, both of these rulemakings are in the water quality standards space. And if you don't know what that is, water quality standards are established by states and tribes with TAS, with treatment as a state status. They're used, these standards are used to evaluate water quality, impaired waters are identified for watershed planning tools that are based on those water quality standards. Effluent limitations from discharge permits are based on water quality standards, and so are certifications under 401. So water quality standards world really kind of permeates every aspect of the Clean Water Act you can think of. And so these 2 rulemakings that EPA is undertaking right now, one would really change the way states establish their water quality standards. And the other would establish sort of these baseline water quality standards on all tribal lands. Together, they might have a really significant effect, like I said, on Clean Water Act's administration across the country. I'm going to go a little bit deeper on both of those rulemakings and then see if you guys have any comments or questions about it. But the first rulemaking would require states to protect tribal reserve rights as the states developing statewide water quality standards. So where there are tribal reserve rights, the state's standards have to be protected. What does that mean? Well, it depends on what the reserve rights are. It could mean water quality has to sustain a certain amount or type of fish for fishing rights. It could mean that a statewide human health standard must account for tribal or sustenance level fish consumption in the development of those standards, instead of sort of the general population's consumption of fish for these statewide standards. And at the end of the day, it gives EPA a role to approve or disapprove how the state has decided to protect those rights. So that's a significant new area where EPA is going to have a lot to say. I think EPA went down this path a few years ago on a state-by-state basis in Washington State and Maine. You may have heard about some of these things in Idaho as well. But now they're pursuing it as a national rulemaking where every state where there may be tribal interests has to account for those reserved rights in some way. But again, that was in the details though, on that one. The second rulemaking is baseline federal standards that EPA wants to promulgate that would apply on all tribal lands that don't have their own treatment as a state program. They're federal water quality standards, not tribal water quality standards. So that's pretty significant as well. I think the EPA has been frustrated over the many years that more tribes haven't picked up their TAS programs, that more tribes aren't doing their own administration. And instead of pouring resources into those tribal programs, it's going to just become a federal program that EPA runs. And so those two rules flying totally under the radar. EPA's already completed tribal consultation on them. They wrapped up consultation 2 weeks ago. But I haven't seen a single press release, I haven't seen a single article, I haven't seen anybody, wondering how this is going to affect state programs, how this is going to affect discharge permits upstream of tribal waters, and how states' ability to run their programs might be affected or might be just changed by these regulations. So I want to put this out for all of you guys because it was new to me, and I try to pay close attention to stuff like this, and it kind of took my breath away. And so when we're talking to folks who are running businesses and running state programs where there are tribal interests, this is going to be a big deal and two very important rulemakings. EPA is planning to propose in the spring of next year. So just keep it on your radar.
When I think of all the tribal treaties that underpin the history of Oklahoma, 39 federally recognized tribes, all of which had treaties at one time or another that had some, and in many cases, multiple treaties, as we've seen. It really could have a profound effect on how a state promulgates their own water quality standards. We know these waters flow through patchworks of jurisdiction in those states that have tribes, and so you can have one set of standards one place and the federal set and the up and downstream impacts are going to be important.
So one thing I want to mention is Anna and I, when we were analyzing issues in Washington, in Idaho, and in Maine, some of this law had been developing through guidance and through individual decisions. And so, set aside whether or not there's the right answer, the wrong answer, the policy choices, just set all that aside and just from a lawyer, how do you impact regulatory change? You got to get through rulemaking. And so, we gave the career staff at EPA some pretty simple guidance. If you want to accomplish this policy objective, you need to go through rulemaking. And that is what we're seeing right now, which is they're doing it right. They're doing the process. It's quiet. And the other point I want to make is if you want to see how this administration came in talking about climate change and environmental justice as sort of the twin pillars, particularly the twin pillars of their natural resources or the Environmental Protection Agency agenda, this rulemaking, these dual rulemakings, is environmental justice playing out in a regulatory setting. A lot of the lawyers, we all bang your boxes with blogs, and newsletters, and alerts, and you get way too much information in your inboxes. This one's quiet, right? We're all writing about what environmental justice might look like at EPA. This is environmental justice translating over to a regulatory issue through a rulemaking. And so the interesting thing is they're doing this pretty quietly, which is, I suspect, they would prefer to get this pretty mature and out to proposed rulemaking before they start getting questions raised by states or regulated entities. But this is environmental justice playing out in a regulatory setting in a very concrete way.
All right, now that we've sufficiently scared you, we can talk about something slightly less scary, which is not true. The Waters of the United States rule, and this is a topic that is not new to this crowd. We were talking about it 4 years ago in Charleston. They've been talking about it for 4 years before that. you've lived it for many, many years, both as a practicing lawyer, a state fighting it, and a lawyer writing it. What is the exact state of the waters of the United States rule that the Trump administration put forward, or even the Obama rule?
Well, so the law of the land right now, at least according to EPA, is the regulatory program that was in place before the 2015 Obama Clean Water Rule and before the Trump administration Navigable Waters Protection Rule. The law of the land right now is the 1986-88 regulatory regime that had been amended through Supreme Court precedent, also through the famous Rapanos guidance, the Swank guidance. So we are back to the system that we're operating in from the 1980s, 90s, and through the mid 2000s, where the significant nexus analysis, Justice Kennedy from the Rapanos decision, that's back in play. When we wrote the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, we did potentially anticipate a loss in the district court. And so we did breathe life back into some of that early guidance documents that industry, at least, it's a playbook that they know how to be regulated by. So the law of the land right now is the 86-88 regime. The Obama rules off the books, Trump rules off the books. And the litigation may still have something to say about that.
Back to square one and waiting on the courts. Is that fair? Yeah. Anna, what are some of the things that we can anticipate from a new rule?
In the waters of the U.S. space?
Yeah.
It's a great question. You hear the administration talk about wanting to find something that's durable. I've actually heard more talk recently about just codifying the 86 regime that's been in place through guidance over the years. So, if they really want to do it right, maybe there's some space there in the middle, but I think there's going to be just so much pressure from stakeholders to go above and beyond, to go to a place that may not be durable. So I think if they want to really set their mind to it, they can probably do something that would stick in the court, but it's very, very challenging in this political environment.
It was for us. You were criticized for not going far enough.
Yeah, both directions.
Yeah.
Right. So I was aiming at the property rights group really not being happy with what I proposed or what we wrote. The ENGO community really not being happy with what we wrote, and the regulated community being mildly disappointed. Right. I was aiming for mild disappointment as a measure of success. That is a really weird space to operate in, but obviously I'm biased, but we really did try to find a middle ground. The Navigable Waters Protection Rule, it regulated all intermittent waters. The regulated industry, a lot of folks in this room probably aren't really happy with that, right? I drew the line at ephemeral versus intermittent because that was a very clean line. You can implement it out in the field, and I felt very strongly that ephemerals were to be regulated, if at all, by the states. And that's one of the great fallacies of this debate is if the federal government doesn't regulate, all hell breaks loose. We forget that there are 50 states out there with mature programs, amazing staff at each individual state that regulates. They know the resources best. And so we focus on sort of rebalancing, reframing, that power relationship between the federal and state government. I think what's going to happen now is the Biden administration is talking about trying to find durability and balance, but I would expect them to go back to regulating ephemerals, if not all of them, at least most of them. I think they're going to feather jurisdiction back out in the watershed. So the isolated ponds, the isolated wetlands that were theoretically somewhat in play under the 86-88 regime, definitely went all in under the Obama 2015 rule. Those are going to come back and play. And I think Anna's right. How do you create durability? Politically, they're not going to be allowed to do that, right? They're going to say the right things right now that they want to do a middle ground between the Obama rule and the Trump rule. But if they're going to start with a baseline and they're going to start writing from something, are they going to start from the 86 regime, which was kind of hard to implement and quite frankly needs Supreme Court precedent to overturn some of the reg text? Are they going to start with our rule? Well, no. They've already stated they're not going to. So I think they're going to use the 2015 Obama administration rule as its base and go from there. And then the question is, can they restrain themselves? I was, working for the state of Wyoming and then the state of Wisconsin, helping lead the 31 states litigating against the 2015 rule. And it really wasn't all that hard to try to shoot that down because they extended beyond what I thought was statutory authority. The question is can this administration show restraint? It'll be interesting to watch that play out.
I do want to make a point, and Scott Thompson, my DEQ director, and Rob Singletary, his chief of staff, and our former general counsel are here. Not only do we have strong programs in the state, but we actually implement the programs for the federal government. And I think that gets lost in this shuffle of, oh, if the federal government's not, we're just walking away from these streams. When in fact, that same federal government entrusts states to implement those programs. And I think that gets lost a lot of times. I think the political pressure point is also a great one because you felt it. I mean, it was from a different direction, but that you weren't doing enough. And I think that's the real harm is we don't get the opportunity to sit down and say, okay, let's all get uncomfortable and get something that states, tribes, the federal government, industry, NGOs all know the law.
About political pressure, and I think there's going to be a strong drive to sort of regulate, forget about federalism, talk about federalism, not trust the states, and go back to regulating through subjectivity, which means when you're out walking the back 40 in agriculture or out in the oil patch, we might not regulate it until we go out and see it. And I will tell you that when the regulators out on the ground and they see wet ground, they're more likely than not going to follow regulations. I think we're going to see a return to subjectivity.
So we've talked a lot about states and tribes and even water quality standards. And Anna, you went and you were responsible for the writing of the 401 rule that was issued under the Trump administration. Dave may have signed it, but you wrote it. And one of the things I found fascinating was how you went back to the actual congressional intent on the writing of the Clean Water Act. What a novel idea to actually figure out what Congress intended when they wrote that law. But before I let you dive into that, why don't you tell states why 401 is important to them?
Sure. Well, 401, Section 401 of the Water Act requires that states issue a certification for any project that may discharge into any navigable water if that project requires a federal permit. So any federal permit, it's an Army Corps permit, it's a FERC permit, there are countless others, ATF issues permits for, wineries and spirits distilleries that discharge trigger federal permitting, and states are responsible for certifying that those federal permits satisfy state water quality standards. And in energy-oriented states, you see a lot of energy projects, pipelines, infrastructure. You'll talk about this all week, I'm sure. And many of those are interstate projects, meaning that more than one state has an obligation to issue a certification. And for around 50 years, although it's a federal program, it's a Clean Water Act program, states are the primary administrators of Section 401. And the federal government has largely been hands-off, and by that I mean EPA, and also many of these federal agencies not really understanding the requirements under 401. So with EPA being hands-off, for many, many years, states have developed their own programs, their own procedures, their own substantive requirements, and so it's really a patchwork from state to state. So when you have something like a multi-state pipeline project, for example, you might have 4 or 5 different procedures, 4 or 5 different substantive requirements, all that are supposed to meet the standard of Section 401 certification. And so, with that sort of backdrop, I think there's been a lot of litigation over the last decade or so around 401, with a handful of states making decisions under 401 that affect business interests and really foundational interests of other states. And so, the 401 rule that we developed was really intended to try to set a standardized approach for 401 from state to state across the country, so everybody knew the rules of the road, right? Going back to the rules of the road, which is what Dave was just talking about in waters of the United States, you start to pick that apart, and you're really guessing, well, what am I gonna have to go through to get my permit, to get my approval, my certification in this jurisdiction? And what does it look like in the next jurisdiction?
I want to put some context around that from the state perspective. And this is in conjunction with Rob and Scott from DEQ. We issue these certifications all the time. It could be a highway project, it could be a pipeline. For Oklahoma, it's traditionally a 60 to 90 day process. So I think that's important context when we talk about some of the things that you did. And tell this crowd about kind of that nuance that if a state just doesn't respond, what happens? Because it's a really interesting loophole from a lawyer's standpoint. Not from the company who's trying to get it done.
Well, so the Clean Water Act requires states to act on a certification request within a reasonable period of time. That's not to exceed 1 year. Under the statutory framework, if a state fails to act on a certification request, then the requirement for certification is waived. And so a state, if it doesn't act timely, loses its opportunity to certify a project. And in the certification process, the state is given the opportunity to add additional conditions to ensure that your water quality standards are complied with. And so, Ken, you're talking about 60 to 90 days as the state of Oklahoma's standard operating. Some states take the full year, some states take certain actions to maneuver and get more than a year through either a coordinated scheme with the applicant to sort of delay that ultimate certification decision. And then again, some states just either purposefully or inadvertently waive that certification and miss that opportunity altogether.
And Dave, what are some of the consequences, the reason the 401 rule was important to write?
Well, there were a couple of fairly significant policy drivers that actually got mentioned, both of them, in the governor's panel yesterday. And when I was sworn in and I was called over to the White House and said, hey, we've got this terminal out on the West Coast, we've got the pipelines in New York, and we're understanding that states are able to hold up these really critical infrastructure projects. And having worked in Wyoming at the time that there was a war on coal, and I saw the tax base or the natural resource extractive tax base directly implement whether or not they build schools or not, including my kid's school. It was supposed to be reconstructed and then it immediately was taken off. It was about Wyoming getting, at a high level, about Wyoming getting its coal overseas, right? Or getting some additional natural gas resources inside New York. But those were the major infrastructure, but they were really illustrative of the overall underlying issue in 401, which was the lack of certainty, right? So the lack of certainty in the process, not really understanding the rules of the game, and then raising some fairly significant big ticket questions about, what is the power of the state to to be able to override based on water quality, certainly the Clean Water Act, that's what it is, the Clean Water Act. But can the state override some of these permitting decisions based on things that weren't really related to the Clean Water Act? What authority did Congress give EPA and the states under the statute? It was water quality based. But in some of those denials, in the Washington case, the New York case, it was really more related to, climate change, whether or not it was technically the war goal. And so what we, this is interesting, we were accused, one of the reasons why I was hired for my job is I worked for 2 states, believe strongly in state power, and really was focused on rebalancing that relationship between the federal and state government. In the 401 space, I was rebalancing away from the states a bit, and I were really focused on what was the framework that Congress intended, what's the way this is supposed to work. And so, I'm not wildly popular in the states when we basically said, hey, you know what, there are some limitations in what you can do in your certification process. So, but the drivers really were about those big ticket infrastructure and who gets to say, like if you're not going to allow a project to go forward, who's the decision maker in that? And that was really the driver.
Governor Gordon and Governor Stitt both testified at EPW on the hearing and with Washington State there. It was really interesting, but the viewpoint from Oklahoma is we have products that we believe we can get out in interstate commerce. In our case, it was natural gas to the East Coast, to places like Maine, New Hampshire that would love to have clean natural gas. For Wyoming, it was coal to get to the terminal in Washington and go to Asia. And again, you heard that the actual benefits of burning Wyoming coal versus international coal actually improved the airshed. But we viewed it as, okay, if they tell us we can't because they don't like natural gas, will they tell us that they don't like our beef being sent throughout the country because of climate change? And so we saw it as an infringement on states' rights, even though it does technically, and it's been interesting to see, the Biden administration in overturning 401 champion that, oh, we're the friends of the states, and then every other thing they do tells us that states are irrelevant, including their view on waters of the United States or otherwise.
Yeah, I think that 401 is sort of this sleeping bear that we talked about for a long time. For decades and decades, it was just sort of, it was either a quick process in most states, in most cases, and then we started paying attention to it. And now it's a pretty effective weapon to drive policy. And if EPA needs to rewrite, expands the scope of what 401 and the Clean Water Act was intended to regulate, then it can become a very potent weapon for all sorts of industries and interests. And so what we really try to do is cabinet, keep it tied to water quality, keep it tied to the state's water quality standards, really, which was the driver. If you read congressional history on it, they wanted to make sure that the federal government, through its permitting process, couldn't run roughshod over state water quality standards. That is the essence of 401, and it's been used so differently by some states that if you don't rein it in, you're gonna have problems across the economy.
401, it has risen in prominence, and it really is going to be a significant issue over the next decade. We kicked the hibernating bear with the 401. When I walked into the building at EPA headquarters, I might have doubled the 401 knowledge in the building. There's some out in the regional offices. One of our last calls on 401 as we're going through the nationwide permitting, the Army Corps of Engineers 404 nationwide permits, and having to run through the 401 certification for that. We had 50 to 100 people on the phone call across the country. EPA staff. Yeah. And they're like, this is a cool new tool, right? We just gave them some great tools for Christmas. And so, should we have done the rulemaking? Yes, because it was a 50-year program that was in conflict. The regulation was in conflict with the statutory text. As a lawyer, that drives me nuts. And it needed to be fixed. But, we're now living in a world where 401 is, in the space of becoming a veto style statute akin to the Endangered Species Act. And I think that's the reality for the next 10 to 15 years, is folks in this room, your industries, are just gonna have to get smart on 401.
Yeah, and it's, right now, there's a huge opportunity because of the rulemaking, right? And so Dave and I now, on the private sector side, have been a little bit underwhelmed with sort of the coordination by interested stakeholders. And I think that, folks who are concerned about this ought to get together in a room and try to come up with, a like-minded set of policy issues to bring to the agency, because I know that they're hearing from certain stakeholders on this. I'm not convinced that they're hearing enough from the energy side, from infrastructure at large. I mean, we're talking about trillions of dollars in infrastructure money coming from Congress, and this looming uncertainty with the 401 rewrite. I mean, you can't even square those. And I just don't know if the agency's getting that message right now. So.
As we continue to brighten people's day,
Or good.
but I want to get to Maui, because Maui has certainly been in the news, but I don't think a lot of people really understand what it means.
I'd like to think about it too, but technically on vacation.
Yeah, exactly. You're in Oklahoma City. That's just like Maui. Anyway, I first, we talked about it when we were at EPA under the conduit theory, right? This idea that surface water, those waters that are regulated under the Clean Water Act, are somehow influenced by groundwater or other waters. And, it was how much of that connection needed there to be before it became a water of the United States, that you would have to get a discharge permit. And so we heard for the first time the term functional equivalent. Dave, why don't you explain a little bit about that, and then we'll get Anna's thoughts.
So there's a new world that we're all going to be operating under. So whether or not you need a Clean Water Act, MPS, or a state issued permit for a discharge that goes into the groundwater that eventually travels to surface water, if that pollutant delivery can move from your, whatever it is that you're doing, produce water pit, discharge point, storm water control basin, whatever it is, land application for agriculture, it doesn't get it. So if that pollutant can get through into surface water, at the historical perspective was, Congress sort of kept groundwater to the states. It is a state right. States control their groundwater resources. It's always been a little bit of a question, but the Supreme Court last year, even though it was a conservative court, the Supreme Court ruled in the county of Maui that you can require federal Clean Water Act permits for discharges to groundwater that eventually travel to surface waters if they're the functional equivalent of a surface water discharge. What does that mean? Who knows? Thank you.
It means as much as the significant nexus. So we've got a lot of really solid direction from the Supreme Court in the Clean Water Act.
This is why the folks in the robes probably shouldn't legislate from the bench. So they gave us a 7-factor test. That the functionally equivalent means effectively, you take a look at whether or not the time, distance, the type of pollutant, the pollutant concentration, the subsurface strata, the hydrogeology, if there are hydrogeologists in the room, that's a factor. Whether or not there's dilution that happens. You take a look at all of those, and if it's sort of like what would happen at a surface water discharge, a pipe going into a river, then maybe you need a permit. But it is wildly unsatisfying as a lawyer to try and implement this. And so we tried to put what I thought at the end of our last administration, Anna signed this on the way out the door, wrote it, added 2 courts that EPA could add factors. And one thing that we all do in this room is you take a look at systems design. You put a septic tank in the ground at your cottage, right? You run your septic sewage into that septic tank. It's designed to treat and then run the leftover water, wastewater, the groundwater, do some additional treatment into the soil column. this thing is designed to be kind of not going straight to surface water, but going into the groundwater and treated. What EPA just said, when they overturned the guidance in Anna Road, was you can't take system design into account. It's contrary to clean water. They didn't explain why. They didn't tell us what the law is. They just said it's contrary to the Clean Water Act, can't take system design into account. So that basically, we were basically trying to say, if you design a system to be able to kind of take advantage of the hydrogeology to treat the water, that is no longer relevant in whether or not you need a permit. That is opening up Pandora's box to permitting.
Yeah. I mean, you know, all of the factors that the Supreme Court actually outlined, you know, it's a non-exclusive list of 7 factors. The court was very clear. There may be other factors. And the reality is, from a permitting perspective, you really do look at the facility design and operation first, and because it does affect every one of those other factors that the court raised. And so we started to try to just put it into a practical context for permit writers at the state level and in EPA, and for the regulated community to understand how these factors work within this long-standing program. And EPA said you can't. And they said this factor is inconsistent with the Supreme Court's decision, which there's also no basis for that conclusion. So the frustrating part about Maui right now is that what little guidance we were able to pull together to try to put it into context for this permitting program is now gone. And what is left is a total vacuum where more folks and roads are going to be opining on very technical, very complex issues. And nobody knows what the rules of the road are. So, you know, strike 4 on the rules of the road. There's just no way to find regulatory certainty in this space right now.
Again, going back to that state perspective, the states have almost, and tribes have almost always exclusively regulated their own and administered their own water rights to groundwater. Is Maui a threat to that right of the states?
I would say that there's a real concern that there is a threat to the state's authority in that regard. The EPA's rescission of the Maui guidance also contained a very clear statement that the state's groundwater protection program does not determine whether an NPDES permit is also required for a discharge through groundwater. And I think that that's probably accurate under the Supreme Court's decision, but it also really leaves no room for states to make the case and say, look, you know, this is a robust groundwater protection program that also protects the downstream or down gradient surface water discharge. I think it makes it much more difficult for states to rely on long-standing groundwater protection programs, even those that are incorporated and sometimes go hand in hand with NPDES state programs. It's just sort of a different dynamic to try to find your way through to get EPA to agree with the state's position on one of these things.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's, you know, is it a risk to the water rights folks? You know, you get to decide, you know, who gets to use the water in what volume and what amount, right? And EP will say, on states' rights over the groundwater. We're just talking about the quality of it. But, you know, the EPA folks, you know, really haven't worked in or, you know, understand the state intersection there. They just look at it, you know, fairly in sort of black and white terms. It's, you know, this isn't about, you know, how much water you can use. This isn't about, you know, whether or not you get to regulate the quality of your groundwater. It's just, this is just your groundwater's flow through from what we get to regulate. And, you know, that's just not the way the world works. That's not the way science works. And that's certainly not the way the complicated relationship between federal and state water quality, water quantity law interacts. And so I think, you know, if I was a state secretary, you know, you know, up until a couple of weeks ago, what I would have done is try to get some clear guidance in my permitting program on how a state delegated program sees when you need permits under your delegated program. And I would have tried to put some very clear boundaries on, in functional equivalent analysis, system design, groundwater protection standards. What EPA just did a couple of weeks ago, in a page-and-a-half memo, without public comment, without going through the interagency review process, without talking to the state, is they basically now put, you just say, Ken, you want to do that here. You'd almost have to lead with your chin and put system design in and put in your groundwater protection programs. And you're basically daring EPA to sue at that stage. And I think it may be what it's going to take for a state to sort of lead and try to put some legal boundaries on what EPA just did a couple weeks ago. Democracy dies in the darkness. That just happened in this space a couple weeks ago.
And your guidance, you put out for public comment?
We did, yeah. Why don't you walk through the process? That was so much fun in the last couple months.
It was one of the last things that we were able to get done, and we put a draft guidance out for public comment. 30 days, I think. Received hundreds, if not a couple thousand comments. I personally read every single one of them. And then we developed a response to comment document. I mean, it was a true notice and comment process. There's, the draft, the final, the response to comment document, and a fact sheet was all developed through the course of a, 3 or 4 month process, and it was wiped away in a page-and-a-half with no comment, no process, no notice, nothing. And so, setting aside our work on it, there's sort of a procedural question. I'm like, well, what else can you just flip a switch on and create chaos? I think there's a lot of opportunity in their taking so far, a lot of them on.
The irony is in their press release, they criticize the lack of public process and interagency process for our guidance. And I'm just a tad bitter about that. Because the guidance document we really wanted to write looked dramatically different after we got beat up by the Department of Justice and Office of Management and Budget and everyone else. We went through that slog, and we basically limped out with with our system design as at least we got something done. But to be criticized for not doing the interagency review process, not doing public comment, the irony of eliminating our guidance document with a page-and-a-half without any of that is just, anyway.
And not in a page-and-a-half, that's without consequence. There are legal conclusions in that document that are going to have effects on programs across states. And so it's difficult. It's a difficult environment right now.
Well, now that we've literally given you guys some really good news to take home to you and take to your lawyers and talk about that, I'd love for you to we're out of time, but I'd love for you to give these two true experts a hand. And I think we are on a networking break. Yeah.